हाँ, मैं पूछे पहले उनको इंट्रोड्यूस कर देती हूँ फिर। ठीक है सर। ओके। हेलो। So, Manu ma'am, am I visible now? Kindly unmute, Manu ma'am. Manu ma'am, kindly unmute and say, Manu ma'am. Hello. Okay, sir. So, shall I start now? Now, Mehak ma'am, I am visible now. We are visible. Our presentation is visible now. So, I think it is 11:05. We should start now. So, first of all, good morning, all of you. Good morning, presenter and all attendees. So, I, Rashmi Rameshwari from Department of Biotechnology, welcome our guests and viewers on this live session. We all know that COVID-19 has affected more than 200 countries, and not only economy is affected, but our students as well as teachers are also affected. So in this uncertain situation, we have to remain positive, and always we should keep in mind that when going gets tough, then tough gets going. So this is high time, and we should strategize our learning process. We should keep on learning, and for that, Department of Biotechnology has taken a great initiative to connect with eminent researchers, scientists from different parts of the country. So today we are overwhelmed to have our speaker, our guest today, and she is Dr. Mehak Sharma, and she is Associate Professor and Wellcome Trust DBT Senior Fellow in the Department of Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, popularly known as ISHR, and which is in Mohali, India. So before going through, let me give you her brief introduction, her educational background, and for our students, it is a great motivation that she has done BTech from Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University, Delhi. She has done BTech in biotechnology. After completion of her biotechnology, she was directly inducted in PhD program at University of Nebraska Medical School, and she completed her PhD. After completion in October 11, she moved back to India to set up her independent laboratory. So now coming to her research work, her research background. Her research is focused on studying the molecular mechanisms regulating membrane trafficking towards liposomes, and how pathogens manipulate the endosomal pathway for their growth and survival. Her current research has revealed the role of lysosomal small GTP binding proteins of ARF-like subfamily and their effectors in fusion of endosomes and autophagosomes with liposomes in mammalian cells. So the same machinery is exploited by Salmonella typhimurium and intracellular pathogen for its growth and survival within the mammalian host cell. So now with such a research work, such a great outcome, she was directly she got with this significant discovery. Mehak madam research profile was featured in leading international research journal in the field of cell biology, Journal of Cell Science and Journal of Cell Biology. She is presently holding positions in many editorial boards like Cell Science and Journal of Cell Biology, Traffic, eLife, and not only this has stopped her. She has received various awards including B.M. Birla Prize in Biology, INSA Professor Harswarup Memorial Award she received in year 2019, DBT National Women Scientist Award she received in 2018, INSA Medal for Young Scientists, and many more like NASA Young Scientist Platinum Jubilee Award, Sir Women Excellence Award, Welcome Trust DBT Intermediate Fellowship, and with such a brilliant profile, and she has started her career and she is doing a lot in the field of biotechnology. So now, ma'am, welcome you for today's webinar. I now over to you, ma'am. You can start your speech now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rashmi, for such a kind introduction.
Thank you.
Right at the outset, I want to tell my audience that I am not an expert on coronaviruses. I've never worked with them, but what I can say is that coronaviruses infect our cells, and I'm a cell biologist. And so through that connection, I feel that I am able to understand a lot of information, scientific information that is out there, and that is what I've tried to do in this talk, compile some of the important basic facts about coronaviruses and how they establish infection in our cells. Rashmi mentioned to you that my own research is on the membrane trafficking or endocytic trafficking of cargo. And many times these viruses, including the SARS coronavirus 2 and its other family members of coronaviruses, they are endocytosed by the cell. And we do hope that in coming years we will be able to combine the expertise of membrane trafficking that my lab has and look at this particular pathogen which has basically brought humanity to a halt. But for today's talk, I would like to just focus on whatever information is out there and give you some of this information and hopefully answer the questions that you have. I want to start my talk by saying that we are witnessing history in making, something of this magnitude, which brought all the world together in kind of in one response against this pathogen. This has never happened before. So we are actually living through history. It is very challenging, but it is also an amazing opportunity to unlearn, relearn, and test our capabilities and value systems, as one of these authors said in a recent article. So my aim in this talk, as I mentioned before, is to kind of give you some basic facts about coronaviruses, some historical perspective of how did we get here, how does this particular virus, the SARS-CoV-2, cause infection, and what is the role of immune system in development of this disease, which we call as this severe acute respiratory distress. And I'll end my talk with the physical distancing. What is the principle behind it? Why are we advocating lockdowns and physical distancing? And information about some potential treatment options that are still in the pipeline. Nothing is out there, nothing is proven in a randomized clinical trial yet, but some drugs which appear to be promising against this disease. So with that, I would like to give a context to, that's the way I do it. I want to give you a context of what this virus is, and I think this is very well illustrated in this next slide, which is actually a question for the audience. So you are looking at a picture of a culture of bacterial cells. In this case, this is the bacteria Escherichia coli, your laboratory workhorse, which we use for many kinds of experiments like recombinant protein production. So you are looking at a culture of this bacteria, and I want you to guess that what is the total number of bacteria in this tube. Yeah, Is it the number of people in, let's say, Mohali, where I am, or in Punjab? Is it less than or more than the number of people in India or the number of people in the world? So think about that. 7 ml culture of this E. coli bacteria. The correct answer is, well, the bacteria here is 7 to 10 to the power 12, and it is more than the number of, actually almost 100-fold more than the number of people in the world. Okay, so clearly this gives you a context of how small these microorganisms are. And this is bacteria. When we come to viruses, you look at the flu virus here, it's actually 10 times smaller than the bacterial cell. So that is the scale of things that we are talking about. Our cells, for instance, here is a typical animal cell. Okay, so this is approximately 100 times bigger than the bacteria, the virus cells. And this principle that viruses are smaller than bacteria was also the principle of how viruses were actually first identified. So Chamberlain and Pasteur, two scientists, and this is some history here. Chamberlain and Pasteur, they developed this porcelain filter, which basically contains this, it's a chamber made of porcelain, and in between it has a metal tubing, and the water flows into the tubing from, filtered by the porcelain, and the property is such that the water which is coming in the metal tube cannot contain anything which is below, let's say, 0.2 micron, and so all the bacteria just gets removed from the water which is coming out of this filter. And in 1892, Dmitry Ivansky showed that the filtrate from such a porcelain filter actually could transmit, still contained that active pathogen that could transmit disease of a tobacco plant. Ultimately, this was revealed to be not a bacteria, but actually the first virus, tobacco mosaic virus. And this is how the viruses were first identified, based on the fact that they were smaller than a bacterial cell. So let's just again go back to this context of things again, just to, kind of practically realize how small is the virus. Look at some of the small things that if you just pluck out your hair right now, the width of that hair, the width of a strand of your hair is this 0.1 mm. Now, how small is the virus? Here is the number. You can actually fit in 1,000 viruses along the length of along the width of your single hair. So, just you can kind of do that and imagine that the width of this hair can fit in 1,000 viruses. That is how small this pathogen is. Yeah. So now coming to some basic facts about viruses. This is microbiology 101. You know this probably already. Viruses generally are made up of 3 kinds of molecules. The outer membrane that consists of phospholipids. So that is basically a lipid membrane. There are proteins that are embedded in the membrane and they make the virus envelope. And the genetic material of the virus, it could be a DNA, it could be RNA. So we have DNA viruses such as herpes, we have RNA viruses or retroviruses. In this, in the case that we are going to discuss today, coronavirus is an RNA virus. Viruses are not regarded as, acellular. It is, it is these 3 components which come together. Okay, so there is a famous saying that virus is basically bad news wrapped up in a protein envelope. Okay, so not regarded really as a cell, but acellular. They are not alive outside their host cells. They do not have any internal organelles. They cannot metabolize things, and so generally not regarded as alive outside the host cells, and obviously cannot replicate outside the host cells. They need to reside within the host cell and use the machinery, the replication machinery of the host cells to replicate its genome and to synthesize new proteins, and therefore to make more copies of itself. Okay. Viruses, they can infect all forms of organisms, including bacteria, archaea, fungi, plants, and animals, and they are termed, they are called as animal viruses if they are infecting the general class of animals, which includes the human viruses. Viruses that infect bacteria are called as bacteriophages, and plants are called as plant virus. So with that basic information, I would like to now come to the topic that we are going to discuss in detail, which is coronaviruses. You've probably just read this word a million times now in newspapers, on social media. So what is coronavirus? It is a family of large number of viruses are come under this family of coronaviruses, and they are mostly positive strand RNA virus. So I want to focus on this word for a minute. Positive strand RNA virus, meaning that their genome is RNA, and positive strand means that the orientation or the polarity of this RNA is 5' to 3', so it's already a sense strand. So as soon as coronavirus infect our cells, they release their RNA right away. The transcription can begin with this RNA serving as a template. And this is different from negative strand RNA virus, which carry complementary RNA as part of their genome. So there the polarity would be reversed, 3' to 5'. And therefore the negative strand RNA viruses also carry an RNA dependent RNA polymerase in their genome to first synthesize the sense strand. Coronavirus don't have to do that because their RNA is kind of ready to go. It's ready to translate into proteins. Can serve as a template for translation into proteins. Coronaviruses, what we know thus far is they infect diverse species, but mostly mammalian and the avian species, and they majorly cause respiratory illness in humans, and there is evidence of gastrointestinal illness when it infects animals. The word corona itself means crown. That is the literal meaning of the word, and it came from the fact that these viruses carry these proteins which are kind of projecting out, and I'll show you some better images of this. So projecting out, and it gives it a crown-like appearance, and therefore the name came to be. So we can look at the components here also of this coronavirus that I just described. You have the lipid membrane, you have the proteins such as membrane proteins, the nucleocapsid protein, the spike protein, and you have the RNA genome of this virus here. It's interesting to note that the genome, so generally viruses are, their genome sizes are small, maybe somewhere between, let's say 5 kb to 10 kb, but coronaviruses actually have a very large genome, one of the largest known genomes in RNA viruses, and this can range between 27,000 base pairs to 32,000 base pairs. Okay. And one of the first images of coronaviruses was taken by this virologist June Almeida back in 1965 using an electron microscope, obviously, because you cannot see these particles with other light microscopes properly. And you can appreciate this crown-like appearance. So think about this for a minute. This is the first image of a coronavirus isolated, and you can see this crown-like appearance of these viruses, and therefore this name came to be. A better image, a better reconstruction of this, the current SARS-CoV-2 is what is there on my next slide. So what you are looking at is an actual 3D printed physical model of this SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And I think now you can probably appreciate more this, this crown-like appearance, the projections of this spike protein. So these proteins that are kind of protruding out, they're called as spike proteins. Very, very important. We'll come to it in a minute. They're actually a trimer of, so there are 3 molecules coming together, a trimer of proteins. Some of them are shown here in closed conformation, some of them are shown here in open conformation. So this, the spike protein can have different conformations sitting on the surface of let's say the SARS-CoV-2, and the virus actually has more than 100 copies of this particular protein on its surface. Okay, and what is the function of this protein will become clear in a minute. So I thought that again we can kind of go back to the history. You have probably not heard the word coronavirus before this year, before this year started, and now suddenly everybody on the street knows the name. So how did we get here? Yeah, so let's trace the path to COVID-19. So we go back, some 16 years ago, before 2003, coronaviruses, they were not considered a deadly virus. There was not much research on them. We knew only of these two coronaviruses. They are, their names are given here, and they were known to infect humans. So we are only talking about human coronaviruses here. They were known to infect humans, but they only caused, mild disease, and generally these diseases were self-limiting, meaning that your immune system can easily take care of it. And if you are an immunosuppressed individual, if your immune system is not functioning properly, only then it becomes dangerous in those individuals. And so there was not much, thought about this by health experts, by scientists, as they were not considered a very, a deadly virus. Everything changed. Well, a lot changed in 2003. Okay, in 2003, a new virus, which we, which is named as SARS-CoV-2 for severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, it emerged in a province in China. And this was a new virus. Okay, this was called as the first pandemic of the 21st century, and this is 2003. And this particular SARS coronavirus resulted in, this number of deaths. 700 people died, and almost, 8,000 people were kind of infected with this virus. But then, within a matter of a few months, so by July 2003, this virus had actually kind of, disappeared or on the verge of disappearance, and then very few events of reinfection, which were primarily, accidents from the laboratory, happened. And so probably because it disappeared, probably because there wasn't, much social media or WhatsApp back in 2003, there wasn't much chit chat about this. And we came to know of this, but we came to know that such a virus can emerge, and this got a lot of interest into the family of coronaviruses, which has really tremendously helped us in tackling COVID-19, and you will see that in a minute. It is very, very interesting, alarming also to know that within a span of 9 years, another new coronavirus actually evolved in this time in Saudi Arabia, and this was called as MERS, for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. So a new virus emerged within less than 10 years, and this one was a deadly coronavirus. So a fearful case fatality rate of 34%. Okay, very few individuals infected, but a large number of deaths. And so this kind of honed in the point that there are now these new viruses that are coming from sources, their origins, we'll discuss it in a minute. And this brought a lot of attention to the coronavirus family, and how they are emerging, from where are they emerging, and what are the sources of this transmission from, let us say, one host to another host. So after 2003, there was a lot of vigorous search for other possible human coronaviruses. 2 more were discovered, which, they are here, NL63 and HQ1. But, these 4 coronaviruses, except SARS and MERS, we call them as endemic coronaviruses. And endemic, the word means a constant presence. They have co-evolved with humans for a long period of time, and therefore they are adapted to humans and cause very minimal disease in humans. So they are are endemic viruses and therefore not deadly to humans. How did these viruses, the SARS coronavirus and the MERS coronavirus, emerge? What was the origin of these viruses? So, as I said, after 2003, there was a lot of research on where these viruses are coming from, and eventually scientists in China, particularly in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they actually identified that the SARS coronavirus in particular comes from bats. So they could find evidence of very similar coronavirus in bats, to the extent that one of these research groups also found the cave in which this large number of bats are residing, and they found that some genome elements of SARS virus is in one particular species of bat and some are in another species of bat. They also found that the transmission probably is not occurring directly from bat to humans. There could be an intermediate host. So for instance, we found a similar genome of SARS coronavirus in a particular organism, a particular animal species called as civet cats, which was also trafficked in the markets of this particular province in China, Guangdong. The MERS coronavirus was thought to also have an intermediate host in camels. Okay, and the SARS-CoV-2, which we'll come to in a minute, is thought to have an intermediate host in pangolin, which is again a wildlife. It's an animal present in the wild and illegally sold in the markets of China, in the Hubei province, where this particular disease emerged. So this is the animal origin of human coronaviruses, and as you can already appreciate from this slide that a lot of these coronaviruses are emerging from bats. So what makes it so special that bats harbor these coronaviruses? Well, one of the things is that bats live in large colonies of more than 200,000 individuals. They can fly long range, hundreds of thousands of kilometers. A number of species, multiple species can exist in the same cave in a large colony, and they can harbor different viruses which have a lot of opportunity to get into the same individuals. So multiple viruses can actually infect the same bat, and they can cause, this would cause recombination between these virus strains and therefore cause mutation of these virus strains. Viruses do not show much symptoms. They do not get sick or die of these viruses. So many of these coronaviruses are endemic for bats. They are just causing, probably causing no symptoms at all in these animals. And so they can harbor these viruses for a very long time. And viruses have a very, a good lifespan for the mammals of their size, which allows for the development of new emerging virus strains. So how does this evolution happens at the molecular level? What is the basis of jumping of these viruses from one host to another? So if you remember, I told you that coronaviruses are RNA viruses. So for their replication, they would need a particular enzyme called as RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, meaning that this is an enzyme which uses RNA as a template to make more copies of the genome, the RNA genome. Now, what is known about these enzymes through laboratory experiments is that there is a high intrinsic error rate. So it does not faithfully, it does not faithfully copies that RNA template but rather it can introduce errors at this particular frequency. So after every, let's say 10 to the power 6 bases, it can introduce an error into the genome, and this would cause a continuous source of point mutations for the replicating viruses. However, this is only one source of mutation for this coronaviruses. The other source that I just briefly hinted to is called as recombination. So I told you that, you know, multiple coronaviruses, so different coronaviruses can actually infect the same host. And when they are present inside the same cell, their genome can actually combine with each other. One virus can capture a genomic fragment from another coronavirus strain and, you know, just kind of combine it with its own genome. And this is called as recombination. And this process is probably much more important than point mutations for viruses to kind of switch to another host. Okay, so that is why, you know, genomic evidence has indicated that there are some similarity of the SARS coronavirus with, let us say, the from bat, and some similarity has been found with the intermediate host, the civet cat, for instance. So this is how the coronaviruses, you know, we think that this is how coronaviruses evolved, and they are jumping from one host to another host. And this brings me to the latest, you know, to this latest event that has happened sometime probably last year, where this particular, you know, virus, which we now call as SARS coronavirus 2. Okay, this is the version 2 because SARS happened in 2003, and these two viruses have a very similar genome. In our late December 2019 and early 2020, we discovered that there are individuals which are showing an atypical pneumonia and having this severe respiratory syndrome. And when the pathogen was isolated from these patients and ultimately its genome was decoded, it was found to be a new pathogen which was not seen before, and we have named it as SARS coronavirus 2, and the disease that it caused, we call it as COVID-19, where, you know, it stands for coronavirus disease 2019 for the year that it was identified in. So hopefully, you know, this part of my talk has given you some idea of the history of how did we get here. The fact that these events have happened now almost, you know, thrice. We have now 3 such, you know, such events where the viruses have jumped from one host to another host, and then ultimately to humans in a matter of, you know, less than, let's say, 20 years. This is very alarming. There are thousands of coronaviruses probably endemic in other organisms and in bats, and so this calls for a lot of research and a lot of preparedness against this particular class of pathogens, because, you know, it's anybody's guess that when will the next new coronavirus emerge from the wildlife. And definitely there is a lot of need to prevent such transmission, such close interactions of you know, wildlife with the human society, to prevent such transmission from occurring. So now I'll switch to, you know, some cell biology of how does this particular virus, SARS coronavirus 2, establish infection. And a lot of information that I am talking to you today comes from our research on the, you know, the 2003 SARS coronavirus. So in the last 20 years, you know, the SARS coronavirus has been studied, and since the genome of these two viruses was very similar, so that really helped in taking research forward to this particular pathogen. And in a very short amount of time, we have a lot of good information about how does this establish infection. So both of these viruses, the SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2, they use a particular receptor which is shown here on this slide. It's called as angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So they use this receptor to attach to our cells, and the spike protein, which gives it the crown-like appearance. So the spike protein directly attaches to this AC2 receptor, and then a cleavage event happens where the spike protein is cleaved into, let us say 2 fragments, and the cleavage is brought about by a protease again present on our cell surface, which has this very peculiar name of TMPRSS2, and also there are other proteases like cathepsin, which can cause this cleavage of the spike protein. So 2 events need to happen. The receptor needs to find this, the virus needs to find this receptor, and then a cleavage or a cutting event needs to happen where the spike protein gets cleaved into 2 fragments, which leads to the virus fusion or virus endocytosis by the host cell. And again, this knowledge that AC2 would be the receptor comes from the fact that SARS also uses this particular receptor for its attachment to the host cells. Now, one very interesting observation about the CoV-2 is that it has almost a tenfold more affinity for this receptor. The spike protein of the CoV-2 has, changes in its amino acid sequence. Primarily, there are these 4 amino acids in the spike protein that allow for a very strong binding to this receptor, much more stronger than the SARS coronavirus. And this could be one of the reasons why this virus is so highly infectious, why very few virus particles are also able to quickly adhere to our cells and attach and get inside. Now, one question that you might be thinking about is what are the host cells, or how would you actually detect these host cells? So as a researcher, you should look for cells which express both of these things, the AC2 receptor and this enzyme. So this can be done through, let us say RNA expression studies, and we have actually databases of human cells, RNA expression profiles of all human cells. And when that was done, it was found that the target cell for SARS-CoV-2 are actually these ciliated bronchial epithelial cells, actually a particular kind of cells called as goblet, mucus producing goblet cells in our nasal passage, and also cells called as type 2 pneumocytes. So these are the 2 primary cell types which act as a host cell for this virus. So type 2 pneumocytes are present in the alveoli, and I'll show you this in a minute. Okay, so what happens once the virus is actually attached and the spike protein is kind of cleaved? So either the virus will directly fuse with the plasma membrane of the host cells, or it will undergo endocytosis, and this is one process which we are really interested in and probably will like to pursue these kinds of studies in my own laboratory. So once the virus is endocytosed, it has to escape from the endosome and release its genetic material into the host cytoplasm. Okay, I told you that these are positive strand RNA viruses, so their genome is ready to go. That means it's ready to get translated into proteins, and one of the first proteins that it synthesizes is this RNA dependent RNA polymerase, which would then synthesize the negative strand, the other strand, complementary strand of its RNA, and then this strand can act as a template for synthesis of more RNA, more RNA genome of the virus. So the minus strand, the complementary strand, acts as a template for synthesis of new plus strand synthesis, which is going to be packaged into the virus particles. Along with this, the virus is also using the host machinery to transcribe the other proteins that are present in its, the viral particle, like the spike protein, which we discussed about, membrane protein, envelope protein. You might read this word here, nested transcription. So this is very interesting. This is very different from the transcription as we understand in, our cells, in the eukaryotic cells. And you can look this up in more detail online. But basically, these RNA all have the same 3' UTR. The 3' end is the same as the RNA genome of the virus, but the 5' end is very different. Okay, so they are just short RNA strands and with different 5' ends, and there are different mechanisms by which the virus can achieve this. And then these RNAs are translated into proteins. Many of them, like the spike protein, the membrane protein, the envelope protein, are obviously transmembrane containing proteins, and such proteins are synthesized in the ER of our cells, in the endoplasmic reticulum of the cell. So that's where these proteins will be localized, and in the Golgi network, the viral genome and these proteins would come together as an intact virus particle, which is now, kind of limited by a Golgi vesicle. So all of this assembly is occurring in this Golgi compartments, and then this Golgi vesicle, like many of the proteins of our cell, will be secreted out or exocytosed from the cell. And so this host cell will now be releasing thousands, probably millions of virus particles into the extracellular environment, which are now ready for next round of infection to new cells. And many times the host cell may actually get killed during this process. The virus just overwhelms the host replication and translation machinery, and so the host cells generally would not survive such event and would die off. So this is the life cycle of the SARS-CoV-2 in the host cells. What is happening at the tissue level? Okay. And this is where I would also like to talk about the role of the immune system. Okay. So once I told you that this virus infects the ciliated bronchial epithelial cells, so we know that it starts its journey in our nose, in the mouth or eyes, wherever the transmission has occurred from. Once the virus has actually infected these tissues, it would travel down to the lungs and particularly to this structure called as alveoli, okay, where these type 2 cells are present. So alveoli are basically tiny sacs of air where the gas exchange would occur. So let's look in a healthy individual. This is the alveoli, the air sac lined by a capillary, and where the deoxygenated blood is coming in and the gas exchange is occurring. Obviously, this is very, very important that this process happens with a particular efficiency, so that we do not have a labored breathing, and we have this exchange of or oxygenation of our blood. There are cells within this, on the structure alveolus, called as type 1 and type 2 cells. The type 2 cells are important for us to know. They are secreting a particular, mixture of proteins and phospholipids called as surfactant, and it maintains the structure of alveolus. It provides surface tension for maintaining the structure of this alveoli. This is the cell. The type 2 alveolar cell is the cell, or type 2 pneumocytes, which is, expressing that ACE2 receptor, expressing that particular enzyme, and so it becomes a target cell for SARS-CoV-2. Once the virus is inside these cells, obviously it is making, copies of itself and probably killing the type 2 pneumocytes in, during this process. The type 2 cells would then also start secreting these alarming signals, which we call as cytokines. And what do these alarming signals would do? They would attract a lot of immune cells to that site. So for instance, one particular immune cell that is immediately attracted to this kind of signal is macrophages. And what macrophages would do is kind of amplify the whole process. So they would secrete a lot more cytokines, cause inflammation in that region, which would increase the vasodilation or permeability of this. So a lot of fluid would kind of seep in. As you can see, fluid is starting to fill in this alveolus. And if the virus continues to persist here, it is not cleared away, then this process just keeps on happening and it is heightened. Okay. So fluid is getting filled into the alveolus, and a lot of innate immune cells are coming in that area, the neutrophils, the macrophages, and causing a lot of inflammation in that site. Okay. This event can quickly progress from moderate to severe, although even this moderate disease condition happens only in very, very few percentage of cases. And there are many factors which I'm not going into the detail of, why some individuals would start showing this kind of moderate phenotype, but it has to do with our immune system. So basically, from this moderate to severe, individuals can progress if the infection is not cleared. And now, as you can see, the alveoli is kind of collapsing due to loss of the pneumocytes, and protein is filling into these structures. Protein-rich fluid is filling in these structures, and this would cause less oxygen to enter into our bloodstream. And you will have a labored breathing, and also this protein fluid can actually seep out into the blood vessel, and it can actually enter into other organs. So I want to quickly show you, one particular slide that I found this morning, which seems to be very informative. What is the role of immune system, or why do certain individuals would have, let's say, probably no symptoms, probably very mild symptoms, whereas other individuals would have a very, very severe response to this infection. And, again, the knowledge is not complete at this point of time. We don't know everything about this. But basically, what happens in individuals who are able to quickly recover from this infection, have mild symptoms, is that their innate immune system, it has a peak. It quickly recognizes the virus, secretes a lot of these cytokines, interferons, but then the innate immune response, the response generated by macrophages and neutrophils actually comes down quickly. While the virus titer is still, it's still kind of high. The innate immune response comes down because now the adaptive immune system, the B cells and the T cells, which are the cells which are, let's say, producing antibodies, also killer T cells, which are kind of, eliminating the infected cells. The adaptive immune system actually kicks in these individuals. And so the inflammation subsides down tremendously. And now a very targeted, generation of antibodies and targeted killing of infected cells is occurring by our adaptive immune system. And as the adaptive immune system takes over, obviously the virus titer comes down within a certain number of days, and this is a good outcome. The people will not show this inflammatory response which has come to be associated with this, the severe disease. A bad outcome happens because of various reasons. The adaptive immunity does not kick in, and actually the inflammatory cells, the macrophages and neutrophils, they kind of stay in this heightened activated state. One of the reasons is that the virus titer is not being cleared because the adaptive immune system has not kicked in. So this constant presence of virus is actually driving a lot of inflammation, and then inflammation basically worsens the situation by causing, this increased permeability to the alveoli structure, and causing this protein fluid into the alveolus and to the other organs. So in summary, just to kind of summarize this part, once the virus enters our cells, it starts making more copies of itself. It starts producing the proteins that are part of the virus envelope, the spike protein, the membrane protein, and it kind of overwhelms the cellular host replication and transcription machinery. And in very few cases, this is 15 to 20%, but this is very variable between countries. In India, we have very, very few cases of the severe disease for various reasons, and the knowledge there is scanty. But let's say in certain percentage of cases, the innate immune system overreacts. The adaptive immunity does not kick in. It damages our lung tissue and other organs, and it leads to problems in breathing and ultimately multi-organ failure, because that protein fluid is also going now to the blood vessels and to the other organs. So this is kind of the summary of what we know about the biology of this virus. I want to quickly touch upon the word that has been used for this particular disease, COVID-19 pandemic. We are in a pandemic. We are facing a pandemic, a crisis of the of unprecedented level. And so what is the big problem here with this particular virus, unlike many other pathogens that humanity has faced before? And this is what, this image and summarizes it, that this virus is highly contagious. It has the ability to spread between individuals, highly infectious, contagious also because of the fact that it can reside in our upper respiratory tract, and it has this very high affinity to that particular receptor, very unusually high affinity, more than the SARS coronavirus. So I thought that maybe giving you some numbers can, probably hone in the point. It's again, this is more assumptions. Probably, these numbers are more likely to be true. An infected person can release, almost 100 trillion viruses over the course of their infection. I want to emphasize over the course of their infection, okay? And every time that you are coughing and sneezing, it's thought, and there are, these experiments which show that you can release, almost 40,000 droplets, tiny droplets from your respiratory system if you are coughing and sneezing. And each of these droplets, well, obviously because of the small size of the virus particle, can contain more than 10,000 virus particles. Many of them will stay, in the air. If the droplets are tiny, some of them will quickly settle down on the surfaces, and therefore these are now active virus particles, which if someone, comes in contact with, can infect that person. So how contagious, or how much how much this COVID-19 diseases will spread? So epidemiologists, people who study model diseases and who study this progress of a disease over time, they're scientists who use, epidemiologists are scientists who use this basic reproduction number, also known as R0. Maybe some of you have heard about it, read about it. It's there in the papers. So this number R0 is used to describe what would happen if an infectious person is to enter a fully susceptible community. Okay, so for instance, in this case, this schematic is showing that this infected individual is able to infect, 2 individuals at the time, and this is based on how long the person is infectious, what is the contacts, what is the number of contacts that this person can come in. So R0 depends on all of these factors. And so here, for instance, the R0 is 2. We can quickly understand that if R0 is less than 1, the disease will die out in a population, because on average, one person will infect, fewer than one other individual, and so the disease will clear away by itself. Whereas if the R0 is greater than 1, the disease is going to spread. And this number, we have been able to estimate it for many diseases. Measles, for instance, is very, very contagious with an R0 of something between 12 to 18. SARS was somewhere between, somewhere around 2. For COVID-19, the data is still coming in. And these numbers will change as the data comes in, but current data suggests that it's somewhere, it has a range between 2 and let's say 6. And this number will, depend on the social contacts, the number of contacts an individual has, and probably the infectivity of a particular individual. So this is not a constant. Now it also means that if we do nothing, if there are no options for this, then this virus would follow an exponential growth. It will infect a large number of individuals, and it would keep on doing so until a large population develops immunity. We reach to a level for this virus. It is thought that we need to have more than 80% of people infected with this virus to reach what we call as a herd immunity. That means that the other individuals who are not infected can also be protected, because everybody else is immune now to the virus. And ultimately, then the peak will come down once the large number of people have developed immunity against the virus. And obviously, that is one stage where we do not want to enter in, because there is a fatality rate of this virus, although it is very low in India as compared to other countries like United States, where it is, up to 6%. In India, it is staying very low, between 2 and 3% currently. But 2 and 3% of large number of individuals is still, thousands of people. We have already seen the number of deaths, more than, I think it's 380, close to 400,000 now that this virus has caused in the last 4 to 5 months. So obviously the option is not to do nothing, and so there are measures that our governments, as individuals, and our governments have taken to protect us from the disease. And I just want to briefly touch upon this. So you need to know how it spreads, and I've indicated to you this in my in my lecture. First and foremost important point is there is no vaccine currently to prevent viruses, this particular virus. We know that in general vaccines are the mode of choice for viruses because immune system is what will protect us ultimately from viral infection. Antibiotics do not act on viruses because they're using our machinery to replicate their genome and to translate their protein, unlike bacterial cells which have their own transcription, translation and replication machinery. Well, I'm sorry to say, but, and you know this already, the best way to prevent illness at this point of time is to avoid being exposed to this virus, okay? And it is very, very difficult for COVID-19, much more than SARS, because now we have this knowledge that the virus may be spread by people who are not showing any symptoms. We call them as asymptomatic people. They are carriers, they are infectious and can spread the virus, but they do not show any symptoms. So it is very difficult to judge if they are actually infected by SARS-CoV-2. And this is something which is very unique to this virus. The earlier virus SARS actually was not infectious in the asymptomatic stage. It only became infectious when a person started to show these symptoms of fever, cough, fatigue. So this is a big problem with this particular pathogen, that the spreading can occur by people who are not showing any symptoms. I want to just explain this, this avoid being exposed. How are we doing this? We have called this as social distancing or physical distancing. Governments have locked down entire countries. We had the same thing in India last 2 months. The idea is to put distance between yourself and other people. And why is this being suggested? Probably you have thought about this. Well, obviously you want to avoid getting exposed to this virus, but why is it so important? Is because you see the virus will follow this kind of trend. If there are no protective measures, the daily number of cases will rise to a peak and then it would come down as people develop immunity or there are no more susceptible individuals remaining. Yeah. Now this line defines the capacity of our healthcare system. If we do not have protective measures such as physical distancing in place, then our healthcare system will get completely overwhelmed and you would see a large number of fatalities because they could not get a proper access to healthcare. And this is exactly what has happened in Italy. Their healthcare system got overwhelmed very quickly, even before the protective measures could kick in, and therefore a number of deaths, and data will come out in coming months probably, but a number of deaths probably happened because they could not get access to proper healthcare, to proper staff and to proper equipment that was needed to help them come out of this severe respiratory distress. So what the physical distancing measure would allow us to do is it would delay the peak, okay, and it would also reduce the number of cases. So the peak would flatten. And this has been called as flattening the curve. You can see there is a delayed peak and the peak is now much more flattened. And now we are staying below the line of the healthcare system capacity. Okay, and this approach of using physical distancing has become a textbook public health response to epidemics, including the spread of COVID-19. So since we do not have a vaccine for this virus, it can no longer be contained. The goal is to slow its spread. I told you that, this kind of exponential growth where R naught is more than 1, it would leave the healthcare system, it would cause exponential growth, it would leave the healthcare system struggling to handle this surge of, so many sick people at the same time. But with fewer people sick, these services are not overwhelmed and the deaths diminish. And this buys time for the healthcare staff to treat, to treat the patients and for the researchers to develop vaccines and therapies. And I want to show you one data of, actual data from 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. What you are visualizing is data from 2 cities of United States. One of them obviously practiced social distancing or physical distancing, implemented it stringently, while the other did not. And you can look at the death rate, compare the death rate in these 2 cities. So Philadelphia still had large gatherings while this pandemic was going on, and quickly their healthcare system got overwhelmed. Whereas St. Louis, this another city, was able to flatten the curve by physical distancing measures. So finally, I want to touch upon this. What are we doing at the front of vaccine against SARS-CoV-2? We know that vaccines they imitate a particular pathogen. They are weakened viruses. It could be a protein of the virus. It could be the virus backbone in another, in another particular vehicle, such as adenovirus. It could be the genomic material of this COVID-19. So that is very, very interesting. Maybe you are only thinking about vaccines as protein, a weakened pathogen or a weakened or a mutated protein of this virus. But in reality, actually, now we have vaccines which could be just the genetic material or RNA of this virus, probably likely mutated so that it forms a weakened virus in the host cell. And such vaccines are there in the pipeline. So currently, this is excellent news, again unprecedented. Both the pandemic is unprecedented, but our response to this is also unprecedented. More than 10 vaccines are already in clinical trial and approximately 120 vaccines are in development. So this is very good news, and we think, actually 2 of these vaccines have already, entering into the phase 3, the last stage of the clinical trial. So we believe that by next year, probably these vaccines will be available. As and when they are available to large number of people in a country like India, that is still a question that is unknown. But it looks like that some of these vaccines are, going to be with us, before the end of this year. And obviously, vaccines are not the only thing that is being tried. There are now other lines of, treatment. You have heard about chloroquine, or hydroxychloroquine is in the papers. ICMR has guided all the frontline workers to take hydroxychloroquine, and they are doing randomized trials also to study its efficacy. I just want to quickly touch upon this. Hydroxychloroquine is thought to increase the pH of lysosomes and endosomes. And once the pH is increased, the virus may not be able to escape from these endosomes. And also, hydroxychloroquine is anti-inflammatory, so it suppresses those cytokines. So this has been, being used in frontline workers, being given to frontline workers in countries, and its efficacy is going to be tested in randomized clinical trial. There are drugs that came into existence because of the HIV virus, and they attack the HIV proteases. So they have been shown to be somewhat effective against the SARS coronavirus. This particular drug, remdesivir, it's an antiviral drug, and it has shown some progress, and it interferes with viral replication. And I think this would also be a positive hit ultimately. Some of these drugs are inhibitors of those proteases which allow the virus to enter into our cells. So with this, I'm coming now to the end of my talk, and I would be more than happy to answer your question. And I would leave you with this quote by the NIH, NIH director, that there is still a lot to learn about this virus, but it has been a remarkable and gratifying journey to watch researchers from around the world pull together and share their expertise, their data in urgent quest to control this devastating virus. I hope that you could, I hope that you could appreciate how much we already know about this virus thanks to the research that happened between 2003 and now on the SARS coronavirus, and also this open sharing of data which has led to quick developments into tackling this particular disease. I've put a link here. I've put some links in my presentation which might be very useful, articles and animations to look at. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Maybe I went slightly over time. Sorry for that. Do visit this website. This is a website of, couple of Indian scientists have come together and they've created this amazing animations, which would help in, understanding more about this disease and for explaining it to your parents and your grandparents. So please do visit it. I have used some of their animations in my talk and they're wonderful, and they would greatly help in communicating about this disease, the right information about this disease to our to our parents, our relatives and our friends. Yeah. Thank you for your attention, and I'll take questions from the audience.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being with us. Now, there is some questions from our student and from our viewers. And the question is that the very first is ki we are having many asymptomatic patient. Recently, it is in news and all. So, can we say that the temperature plays a role here, or immunity or genetic system of the individual has some role in this? So can you put some light?
I think that my best bet would be that if, let us say, a person is infected by low dose of the virus, that means the initial infection was, of a low dose of the virus, probably your immune system is able to take care of it. If you have a good immune system, possibly you are, you don't have any comorbidities like diabetes or cardiovascular disease, age is on your side. So your immune system allows for quick, response from the adaptive immune system. Plus, you are not exposed to that high titer of virus. Possibly those factors are causing an individual to become asymptomatic. They do not have these responses of fever and cough. So immune system has a role to play here. And also probably these individuals were not infected by a high titer of the virus.
Okay, ma'am. So now the second thing is that this virus is mutating very fast. So how future vaccine will be effective? Because might be possible right now we are developing, we are working on some kind of virus, and later on it is going to mutate, as we are seeing the earlier strain which was found in Wuhan is different, which has been sequenced in India. So how this in future this vaccine will be effective?
Yeah, so that is an excellent point, and I cannot deny that cannot happen. So although this virus is mutating very fast, it is not, that is not something which is out of the box. The viruses which contain this kind of enzyme, which is error prone, they mutate at a certain rate, and this virus is following that very well. The thing is that the vaccines are generally, so one vaccine is, let us say, the RNA genetic material of this virus mutated also to make it weakened. But these vaccines are generated against, they are using the components of the virus that are unlikely to mutate, like spike protein. So virus is not, if the virus mutates its functional proteins like the spike protein or its envelope protein, then it would not survive. Such a mutant virus would not survive. So the mutations that are happening are not changing the structure of these conserved proteins. And this is what we are using as targets for vaccine. However, it is possible that the virus, a mutant virus may emerge, which changes, which let's say recombines, takes a fragment from another coronavirus, and it now has a different kind of a spike protein. And the vaccine may not be effective against that virus. That can happen.
Now, the second thing is, you were talking about the herd immunity, and right now, Government of India has started unlocking the phases phase by phase, and people are coming in contact with the infected patients. So, will this herd immunity will be some, you can say that a way to prevent, to develop the immunity against the individual, and like chicken pox and all. So, is this the correct way?
Yeah, I do not, I don't have a very good answer for this, because what I have read about it is that, the number of individuals that need to be infected for the herd immunity to kick in. And this is partly based on that R0 number for this virus. It seems that you need a very large number of individuals, possibly 70 to 80% of your population needs to be infected. Okay. And that would result in a very high fatality rate in a country like ours, which has a very large population. And we do not fully understand, what are the comorbidities that can enhance the severe respiratory distress. So for the herd immunity to actually kick in, it's going to take a huge number of individuals to become infected and become immune ultimately. So indeed, the virus, we have not reached the peak. Cases are still rising in India. But I think that, as the government has been saying, we have to follow those preventive measures. We have to wear face masks. We have to follow the physical distancing measures very diligently, and the hand hygiene and general hygiene in general, to prevent us from getting infected, because we cannot rely currently on herd immunity. Yeah, that would not be a wise decision for a country like ours. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, and we are having billions of population. We cannot expose them. The second thing is, ma'am, we are having diverse population. Means we cannot say that the genetic of individual living in Jammu and Kashmir is more similar to people living in northern India. So in that case, RNA-based vaccine you were telling now, we are in process of development. So how this RNA-based vaccine will be effective for the Indian population?
I think that the genetics, the genotype is different, but it's very minutely different. It's not most of, let us say the genes. Let's talk about the immune system and how this antibody response will develop against the vaccines will be very, very similar. Very, very similar. It would not be different between individuals living in Jammu, Kashmir and Kerala. And the antibody response, which actually we already have this data. We already know of certain kind of neutralizing antibodies that people who have recovered from this infection develop. And this is very similar. The neutralizing antibodies that are being developed, they target a particular region of the virus, and it's similarly being generated in different individuals. So the genetics is not going to cause difference in the immune response for development against for generation of response against the vaccine. But what can happen is that the genetics may play a role in this modulation of the immune response. In one of the slides, I showed that this innate immune system has to subside quickly. Once you have inflamed, once you have caused the inflammation, you have attracted your adaptive immune cells. Now you want the adaptive immunity to take care. This may not happen in individuals because of a certain, a certain, let us say, genotype. So that is where, the progress of a disease might be different between different individuals because of their inherent genotype or comorbidities, that they have diabetes or cardiovascular disease. But I think the neutralizing antibodies that people will generate will be very similar.
Okay, okay, ma'am. So, do we think that this temperature has any role in spreading this virus in India? Right now, we have crossed 2 lakh infected patients, and
Yeah, I don't.
death is more than 6,000. So, can we say that we are having a temperature which breaks this virus replication? Do this temperature has any role?
Yeah, I don't think so. It doesn't look like that. The data on temperature is very scanty. It doesn't look like that temperature is really regulating this, this virus infectiousness. What temperature can do is, what the current conditions are doing is, they are actually, helping in keeping our respiratory distress at a low level. See, in winters, we have generally a hard time breathing because, let us say, because of the cold conditions are, the breathing is more labored. So I think the respiratory distress is less probably in conditions like what we are having now, and it would worsen this. The breathing problems will worsen probably, much more worsen probably in winter, also because of the pollution going up. But I don't think that they are actually regulating the virus infectiousness.
So, ma'am, thanks a lot for these questions. Now, coming to our students' career point of view, because in our viewer, many of our students are here sitting, they are doing, many of them are doing BTech, many of them are doing MTech, MSc, and PhD. So, questions from their side is that how you was benefited from your studies, you did your BTech in biotechnology. So, did it helped you to shape your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so my basic training was in biotechnology, and during that time I developed interest in certain area of biology, which was primarily cell biology and, let's say, molecular biology, and the techniques that I learned as a when I was doing experiments as part of my thesis project in the last year of my engineering. So that those kinds of experiments actually got me very excited to do research, to ask new questions, to design experiments, to tackle these questions. And so that was when I decided that, I would probably end up being a researcher and take up research as a career. And then when I joined PhD, I started enjoying, doing research, carrying out experiments, the outcome of which was very unpredictable and I did not know. And thinking about new discoveries, reading about, the new articles that were coming in. And so my basic training in biotechnology during those 4 years really helped me to develop this curiosity to then take up research as a career. And then eventually during my PhD, I kind of found one area of cell biology, which is membrane trafficking, pretty fascinating. And I stuck to that. I have, stuck to that during my postdoc. And now in my lab also, I'm looking at the transport processes that happen within our cell. So I think it's very, very important to keep yourself, to keep one curious about things. If you are a person who's curious by nature, who likes to read new things and think about how something would be tested, how we can solve a particular question, even if you do not have access to resources to actually do the experiment, but you are thinking about such things, that is one right step to take at this point of time in their careers.
So thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is, did your maximum, you can say that bachelor's education from India, and then you moved to US to pursue higher education. How this Indian education helped you to settle there, or did it give you any advantage?
Huge advantage, yeah, huge advantage. I found that I was very much aware of many of the concepts that were being taught to the graduate students, the PhD students there. So that really helped me in, in the coursework that I was doing for my PhD. As a BTech biotech student, I was already, trained in asking questions such as design and experiments. Our teachers, including Kanan sir, they asked us, these design and experiment kind of questions. So my thinking had already set in into this thinking mode, the conceptual mode, not this, let us say rote learning mode. And so it greatly helped me during my PhD coursework. I already had some practical training in doing recombinant DNA technology experiments for 6 months, which I did my thesis project in biotechnology. And so I could quickly do those experiments when I was, when I had just started training in labs in US. So I could quickly learn those techniques which I had already done before in India. So I would strongly advise the students who are curious about these things that they do take up opportunities for summer internship. There are now excellent laboratories within the country. We have now ICERs, 7 of them are there, and so there are many labs that are looking for students who would like to do summer internship with them. And so these trainings would help them to do experiments and keep yourself updated with current knowledge about things happening in science in the subject of your choice, your passion. And also to start thinking, whenever you study a concept, don't go into this the details of what is already known. Think how it came to be known. So what was the science behind the knowledge? That is what they should be searching for.
Okay, ma'am, thanks a lot. You gave the answers. Now, one last question before ending up today's session. Ma'am, please give little guidance to our BTech students, because some of them are confused what to do after BTech, whether they should go for MTech or they should go for directly PhD. If they want to go directly for PhD, then what should they do? And suppose someone wants to become entrepreneur, so how they can start modifying their thought so that they can become entrepreneur in the future? Because I can see it in your profile that after your PhD you came and you settled your lab in India. So for that, I think you can be the right person for those who are having these things in the mind.
Yeah, so see, this is not an easy question to answer. And honestly, it also took me time to fully settle down into this fact that I enjoy research. So first thing that they should ask themselves, every individual should ask is what is that they enjoy? Would they enjoy working in a lab? Is it possible for them to get some practical experience of working in a laboratory before they think of joining a university for PhD? I would strongly advise that. So for instance, one thing that ICERs have been able to do is that at the last year of this ICER Mohali or ICER BSMS program, the whole year is for the student to work in a research laboratory. So that 1 year allows the student to understand whether they enjoy working in a laboratory or not, whether they like designing experiments and carrying out a research project on their own. If they like it for 1 year and they enjoy working in a lab with a group of other researchers reading about science, then they can be, they can kind of get an idea that, yeah, maybe PhD or research is there, it's one option for me because I'm really enjoying doing this. So I would strongly advise that try to figure this out by getting practical experience in some of these fields. Like, let us say working in a research laboratory, maybe working in a company which has a more entrepreneurial mindset. Do these short trainings, and when you are training with them, please talk to the people around you. Talk to people as much as possible about their experiences. How did they end up there? What were some of the doubts and anxieties that they faced when they were making these decisions, and that can help them in making this decision. A practical, action based plan, and what are the choices that they have for them is something that I would recommend. So just thinking about it would not give them an answer. They should try and get some small, short opportunities to do these short trainings, let us say either in a research laboratory or in a company, to then understand the environment of these organizations. What would it entail? Talk to PhD students, what is your life like, and what do you do? Where do you see yourself? I want to emphasize that, unlike the year 2000 when I did my BTech in biotechnology and then graduated 4 years later, now there are a lot more opportunities of doing these research internships in India. We have several new institutes, several new labs. People have come back from their trainings and established their labs, and they are looking for motivated students. So there are a lot more such research internship opportunities now in the country.
So now today we are going to close the session. Before closing the session, I would like to thank you a lot, ma'am, sparing your time and for giving information, wonderful information on COVID-19, its spread, and how we can future combat in this from this disease. And I would like to thank you, ma'am, for enlightening our students as well, those who are future biotechnologists. And again, I would like to thank our chair professor, Dr. Sanand sir, who just because of his support, we are able to connect you. And I cannot say that this idea was initiated by our Dean Research, Dr. Sarita Sachdeva, and because of her continuous support, we are able to successfully organize this kind of event. And secondly, I would like to thank HOD Biotechnology, Dr. Manu Solanki. And last and not least, I cannot forget to thank Dr. Brijesh, HOD IBM. Without his support, this webinar was not possible. So once again, thank you, ma'am. Thanks all viewers for coming and joining. Definitely, we will have again the next webinar in coming week. And I will be giving you the information on your mail. And those who are not able to join or not able to see, I'm extremely sorry for that. This video will be shared on their email ID. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.